Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for this segment, we have David DeWalt, founder and CEO of NightDragon, to discuss the cybersecurity VC landscape and whether we will see increased funding or M&A activity in 2023. David, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Great to see you, Jill. Great to be back on the show. Thank you for having me.
You got it. Can you talk a bit about the cybersecurity VC landscape that we saw in 2022? What were some of the highlights and lowlights?
Yeah, there's a lot of highlights and lowlights. What a year 2022 was again. It's, as I said before, it's almost this golden age of cyber where we're watching just an unprecedented amount of growth happening in the cybersecurity market. But we also watched in 2022 for the first time a lot of contractions, particularly in the public company multiples to revenue, particularly, in some cases 2 and 3x compression in the forward trading multiple for some of the biggest names in cyber. That rippled into the private sector as well. From an investor point of view, advisor point of view, some of this we see as a very positive sort of outcome that's going on. But 2022 was a big year and significantly up from 2020, a little bit down from 2021, which was an incredible year for investments. And one thing that you'll see is a lot more M&A to your question. The balance between investments now and mergers and acquisitions is starting to tilt a little more towards M&A as we start to see rationalization in the market going forward.
Did cybersecurity see a big impact from the macroeconomic uncertainty that we saw in 2022?
It does, but it sees it in the opposite way than you would typically think, because not only is it almost anti-cyclic when it comes to recession. Typically during a recession, and for one guy who ran cyber companies for 20 years here, McAfee, FireEye, Mandiant, you almost watch the opposite. During recessionary times, there's more crime online. There's more activities that start to disrupt the ecosystem, like ransomware and the plague that's happened there. So you almost see an acceleration of growth in this window of time vis-a-vis the other IT sectors. And it's all driven, Jill, by one major thing, and that's the threat environment. And boy, when you look at the chaos happening in the world a bit, and a bit ominous, but the Russian-Ukrainian situations, the China-Russia tensions that are all happening, Iran, North Korea, a lot of adversaries. It drives a very high threat environment. That drives a very high customer spending environment. And that in turn drives investments and acquisitions. So we're still in a bit of a super cycle when it comes to all of that, and probably will be for a while.
What were some of the biggest categories that saw investment?
Yeah, so couple really big categories, Jill, that are continuing to drive. Industrial security was probably one of the biggest winners in 2022. So industrial security is security that protects what we call our ICS networks, or operational tech networks, OT networks. This is a little different than your traditional IP network, where these are what runs SCADA equipment and has all kinds of industrial ramifications kinetically on physical systems if there's an attack. A couple hot companies like Clarity, Dragos, Armis, all reached 100 million of revenues in 2022 and raised significant capital as well. So that's one really hot area. Probably see some IPOs coming on Nasdaq and that in the near future. Another big area that Gartner calls out is SSE, sometimes called SASE, Secure Access Service Edge. The gentrification of our networks now, with people working anywhere and everywhere, is enabling new types of technologies that leverage edge services. And the edge services like Zero Trust and new ways to connect to networks is very hot as well. Probably most known in the public market is Zscaler, who's done very well in the market, but there's a lot of young companies really starting to grow. In fact, HP made an acquisition just recently of a company that was only about 10 million of revenue for 500 million. So we're watching very hot sectors. And the last one I'll quick say was in the DevSecOps areas, developer security. The government's been pushing a lot around securing by design, and that's really creating an environment for that. And one of the companies was Wiz, who reached a 10 billion valuation and raised 300 million of capital just recently. So pretty interesting in the cybersecurity market still.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that when we had you on for Cybersecurity Month in October about, DevOps and how important that was to the cyberspace. As an investor, did you make any changes to how you approached investing due to the macroeconomics?
Yeah, we did. In this cycles that we watch, Jill, you really look for, what is the best returns for your shareholders? And we're an operating platform. We help hyperscale companies, but we're a growth platform and we focus in on the biggest growth. But what's changed a little bit to yours is the rule of 40, rule of 50, where you have high-end growth at the expense of really operating margins isn't there anymore. You got to have proper guardrails. So what do you really look for? Companies that have 40, 50% growth, but are near profitability or around zero at least. So the days of just growth at any cost are kind of, changing. And so we look for balance, and that balance is really important for our shareholders and potentially for public markets later.
And you had mentioned before that you expect to see an uptick in M&A for 2023. Will the challenges that we're seeing in the banking sector impact VC activity?
I don't think so, because again, you see a lot of a really big growth sector here in cyber, just like you do in biotech and health tech areas. I mean, it's very resistant to that area, but I do think the M&A is going to be big. I call it the clash of the titans, Jill, because we're watching the cyber titans like the Palo Alto Networks, CrowdStrike, Zscalers we talked about, but then the cloud titans like Microsoft and Amazon and Google really get interested. I think Google acquired Mandiant, $5.4 billion acquisition, very strategic move. Microsoft's reached a $17 billion a year revenue base in cyber. Amazon's starting to make a lot of moves in the market as well. So you got the cloud titans, the cyber titans, and then you also now have what I call these private equity titans who are also buying big, like Thoma Bravo and Vista and Insight, who are buying multi-billion-dollar companies and taking them private and potentially creating combinations out of them. So the M&A environment is very frothy, and I think even going to accelerate in the back half of 23.
And finally, David, any advice for startups that are looking to get funding this year? What should they be focused on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. This is probably the hardest time to be a startup. We now have almost 7,000 cyber companies. What a growth we had over the last 3 years, and needed. Because what I always say, Jill, is we have a $400 billion a year spending environment in cyber and national security, but we have a $6 trillion loss environment. I mean, where do you see a P&L like that, right? Here in cyber, 400 of spending, 6 trillion in losses creates a lot of opportunity. So my advice to the founders is look for where there's a big dislocation of risk to what the market already has, and try to close that gap of that dislocation. Most people spend money in cyber and national security because of the threat. If you can help mitigate that threat, find evil, reduce risk, your product's going to be successful. So a lot of that. And then the last thing I'll say is there's a tremendous amount of regulation coming. It's hard not to pick up the newspaper every day and not realize the days of no cyber regulation are over. We're going to see a lot more regulation coming from the United States government and governments around the world that can also drive spending for cyber. So you almost have that perfect storm of threat and now regulation, probably going to give a lot of push to cyber going forward.
All right, David, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thanks for having me, Jill.